Hello, friends. Welcome back to Colliding Worldviews. It's always a blessing to have you here with me as we do talk about the worldviews that collide, worldviews that are held by billions of people throughout the world. Yes, if one group is correct, the other ones are automatically false. Believing something doesn't make it true. Something is true whether we believe it or not. The question is what we believe, does it actually correspond to reality? Does it actually correspond to actual history? Many people sincerely believe many different things throughout the world. But if you are incorrect about that, then you're sincerely wrong. And there's obviously nothing more important than our eternal salvation. And we need to think about not just what we believe, but why we believe it. And if we don't actually have physical evidence or objective evidence outside of ourselves, outside of our mind, that lets us know that what we believe is actually true, well, then we have blind faith. That's exactly what blind faith is, believing something and not having any evidence for it. So objective evidence is what we need to look to, and that is obviously what backs up the Christian worldview. The Judeo-Christian worldview every single year is proved correct more and more because we find objective evidence outside of our minds which corresponds with what the Bible actually says. Archaeological evidence, manuscript evidence, all kinds of different types of evidence that back it up. No evidence has ever proved it false. And of course, one of the types of evidence that we need to talk about and more Christians need to get educated about is the manuscript evidence. Because if we look to the Bible as the Word of God, well, then is that just our holy book and is on the same level as every holy book that every other world religion looks to? No. And the Bible has more manuscript evidence for it than any other book from all of ancient antiquity. If you can't trust the Bible, then you cannot trust any book from antiquity. So it's a blessing to have here with me on Colliding Worldviews today a man who you may not have heard his name before, although he has been on some different shows that we've done. He is doing this heavy research in this area, so you will be hearing his name more and more. His name is Clark Bates. You can find his website at exegesis.com. That's exegesis, kind of play on words if you know Greek and you are involved in Bible interpretation. But exegesis.com is where you can find more about him and his work. This is an area that he's working in. He is fluent in reading Greek. And those are the kind of people who we need to be working with our manuscripts that we have today. Clark, it's great to have you back here, actually for the first time on Colliding Worldviews in particular.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Tony. We've done a few things together, and it's nice to come back.
It's great to have you here to talk about the historical documents. And the question that we're asking today specifically is, are the Gospels historical documents? Are they actual historical documents that back up what happened in the past? Are these just made up? Are they on the same level as fiction books that many people love? Or are they actually accurate? Are they reliable? Are they actual documents from history which lines up with every other historical document out there? Those are the questions that we're asking today, because just to say that the Bible's reliable isn't enough. We need to know, is it actually true? Is it actually reliable? And Clark, it's great to have you here because this is an area that you have really focused on personally. And why does it matter if the Gospels are actually historically accurate?
Well, I think the biggest reason is, and this might sound odd, but it's because they present themselves to be. So what we're dealing with is not so much, a circular argument, but the fact that if they say or they present themselves as historical, then we have an issue of integrity. So if this book, or specifically these Gospels, are not in fact historical, but they are presenting themselves as historical, then you have documents that are essentially a lie at their very core. And if they're a lie at their very core, they're not very much use to anybody, even for something as simple as an ethical or a moral truth. So it's easy for a lot of people to want to say it doesn't matter if they're historically accurate. That's actually quite popular today and in this century especially, to say that really what matters is the spiritual truth or the moral lessons that we can glean from them. But there's more than that. If you read the Gospels, they can't be reduced to that. They make claims about actual events in history. They make claims about a specific person and the things that he did, and that being Jesus of Nazareth. And they make claims that he did certain things, that he even died in a historical setting under an actual ruler, and most importantly, that he rose again. So the Gospels, while we might like to pick and choose certain moral lessons or parables that we like, if you're going to take the documents as a whole, you cannot reduce them to that. They claim to be much more than that. So the question becomes, are they historically accurate? Primarily because they are saying that they are. And if we can't trust them to be historically accurate, then we really have no reason to allow them to be a moral guideline for us either.
And of course, we don't have college professors and students each year criticizing the reliability of Homer's Iliad or the Gallic Wars or the many other historical documents that college students look to, and actually are on the list. If you look at the top books of antiquity, the amount of manuscripts that we have, the date between the earliest writing, or I'm sorry, the original writing and the earliest copy. And if you take into consideration these different factors that fall into this most reliable book from antiquity list of books, the Bible's there number one on the list. And of course, just because that makes the historical, theological truths of Christ and the nature of the one true God of the universe, and it has, of course, religious significance for over 2 billion people throughout the world, that is what people want to attack. And that is why it's so important to ask this question of, are they historically reliable? The reliability of the document and the translation or interpretation, those are obviously three different things, but are all of them accurate? And if we interpret or translate a document, that's fine, but is the original actually reliable? And that's what we need to talk about today, because that's the base of the situation here. How do we determine if they actually are historically accurate?
Well, one of the things we can do with the Gospels, and I recommend this, a lot of scholars do, that we approach them as you would any other document from antiquity. And that's not to say that they're not anything more or anything less, but they are ancient documents. So if we want to look at them in light of the same historical tests that we might apply to any ancient document, then we would apply the same features. So what you're going to want to know is if this is a historically accurate telling of something that's going on that at the time that it claims to be in, you have different things you can look for. You can look at descriptions of agriculture. Descriptions of architecture is a great one. The names of the people and the characters, do they correspond with the names of people that we know existed at that time? You can look at the botany, plant life, the culture, the politics, the religious, social structures that they talk about. So anything that you find, even the geography, or possibly even weather, does it talk about it being sunny or rainy in different climates that you would expect to have that? And when you look at these things, you're asking these questions: is this accurate to what we know? If you might think about how difficult that might be for any of us today. So we have the internet today. I can Google what the weather looks like in the coast of Spain, and I could probably write up a pretty detailed description of the beach. But if you took away all of my electronic information, all of the ability to research faraway lands, it would become almost impossible for me to accurately describe anything of a culture I'd never seen, I'd never lived in a place I didn't know. So accuracy in those details, especially going back to a time when there wasn't a lot of travel, and there would be very difficult for the author to imagine these things accurately, they heighten and they increase the reliability of what you're reading. And so that's the kind of questions you want to ask of the New Testament, of the Gospels. You can ask it of the Old Testament. A great example is actually found in the book of Judges. You find Samson. Everybody knows the story of Samson when his eyes have been gouged out and he is brought before the Philistines and he is going to bring down the temple. It tells us that he places his hands on two columns. Now, they don't make columns in Semitic architecture, but they did make columns in Phoenician architecture because Phoenicians were Proto-Greeks. And Philistines are Phoenicians, and he's in a Philistine temple. So he puts his hands on columns that wouldn't exist anywhere else unless the people he's around use that architecture, which they did. So that's a great example of something very small. It's a minor detail, but it's a huge detail when it comes to testing accuracy. And you can do the same thing with the Gospels. So that's what we would do. That's what we would want to do. That's what I recommend people do. And it's hard for us sometimes as Christians to break out of the mold of simply reading the Gospels for devotional purposes, which is great. I think we need to do that as well. But sometimes we get so used to the stories, we've lost sight of the small details. But when you go back and look at them, that's how you would test it for its accuracy.
Clark, you and I both met at an apologetics academy, and you and I know how important apologetics is for Christians. These details that you're giving, these are the exact type of historical evidence or historical apologetics that we would be using to prove the reliability of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and does it actually line up with history? This is just one of the many different areas of apologetics that people can get involved in and study more about. Because when Christians learn you read one basic book on apologetics, I mean, your confidence is going to skyrocket. And you read, say, maybe 3 books on apologetics, you're going to be able to answer probably 80, if not 90% of the most common rebuttals that you're going to hear on the street or when you're talking with neighbors, coworkers, family members, etc. And also, too, what's interesting, Clark, is that you bring up this archaeological evidence and the little details like that people don't even really think about when they're reading the Bible. That exact same thing is what helps to disprove the reliability of the Quran, which happens to be the second most highly esteemed book in the world. If you take over 2.2 billion Christians and over 1.6 billion Muslims, the details of what the Quran says about Mecca actually is archaeological evidence and geographical and topography. These different types of evidence that actually disprove what many Muslims think about the origin of Islam and where Mecca was actually located. It's the evidence and details that you were just talking about, referring to the Bible, that actually points the origin of Islam being more north, Jordan area, Petra, not down in Mecca, what we now know as Saudi Arabia. So very interesting how this information actually disproves the Quran and the reliability of that. But from that list of stuff that you gave there, can you give some examples of how the Gospels measure up to that list?
Sure. Yeah, and you're right. You can use, I would say, what you're saying about the Quran would be the same as we would apply this test to anything. Even the Book of Mormon claims to be a historical document. So you can do the same thing with that, and you find some of the same results. They're not, they're using names and things like that are accurate for the time period that it's supposed to be set in. But yeah, from that list, as far as we're talking to the Gospels, to the New Testament, you can pretty much use all of them. But I think for time purposes, let's just limit it to a couple. Let's talk about proper names. This is a great one. I talk about this a lot when I'm invited places to speak, and it's more important than most people imagine. And the reason why it's important is because a name is the hardest thing to get right if you don't know how people are named in certain regions. So let me just give you a second to think about this. The most popular names in America 100 years ago are not the most popular names today. And, we've got lists and lists that we can look up. What was the most popular name in the 1970s? What was the most popular name in the 1800s? Those kind of things. Well, you can track that, and you can determine that names increase and decrease in popularity. This is true all throughout time. And the names that are most popular here, even right now in America, are not the same names that are most popular in somewhere like Germany. So just because I might know the most popular names in America, I would not be able to accurately use characters with the most popular names in Germany if I was writing a story about Germany, unless I had that information. And again, we live in a day and age where we can look that kind of thing up on the internet. But take away all of our technology, take away all of our ability. The only way you're going to get that right is if you lived in that region at that time, or at the very least, you knew someone who did, and they could help you with that. So those are really your only two ways of doing that. So what do we do when we apply the name game, the name challenge to the Gospels? Well, if you go back and we look at survey all the evidence that we have of popular names in first century Judea, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you look at ossuaries, which are bone boxes that they would have the names of the dead inscribed on them. You look at the New Testament, you look at things like Josephus, a Jewish writer, and you find the most popular names. Your number one most popular name is Simon. Your second one is Joseph. Your third one is Lazarus. Your fourth one is Judas. Your fifth one is John. Your sixth one is Jesus. I don't have to go much farther than that, but you can go all the way down the list, and you're already hearing names that you hear in the New Testament. Now, the most popular women's names are Mary and Salome in that time period. So the question then becomes, okay, that's great. They got that right, but couldn't they guess that? Couldn't someone just happen to get that right? Maybe they lived in a Jewish population. The author might have lived in a Jewish population somewhere else, which is often one of the claims, that the authors didn't live in Palestine at the time. They didn't live in Judea. So could they have just gotten that right by having Jews around them that lived in, say, Egypt or in Asia Minor? Well, no. The most popular name in Egypt, in Jewish communities, the number one most popular name at the first century is Eleazar. The next one is Sabbatius. You've got names like Dostheus and Pappus and Ptolemaeus, very Greek-sounding Jewish names. None of those names would match anything of what you find in the actual region of Judea at the time. So it's simply by looking at this span of evidence of just something as simple as names, we can go back and say, did they get their names right? And it goes farther than that. This is the most amazing and intricate thing, I think, in the Gospels. It's one of my favorite aspects of it, is that if you have a popular name, even today, if you have a popular name, it means there's going to be a lot of people with that name. So, John Smith in America, it's a very popular name, so you're going to have a lot of Johns. We distinguish names in America. We distinguish those people with their last name. So you've got John Smith, you've got John Taylor, you've got, John, whoever. And that's how we know who each other are. They didn't use last names in the first century. So how do you distinguish if Simon is the number one name in a Jewish community, and the odds are good if you're talking to a crowd of 40 people, you're going to have more than one Simon. How do you distinguish which Simon you're talking about? You add something to the name. Every time the name Simon is used in the Gospels and there's more than one person being addressed, there's an addition to the name. Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Pharisee, Simon the leper, Simon the sorcerer. And what we call that is disambiguation. And that's just a big word for meaning making people see and understand who you're talking to. The Gospels don't bother explaining why they do that. But the reason they do that is because if they didn't do that, the big question would be, well, which Simon? Who Simon who? If Jesus is speaking to a crowd and he's talking to Simon or talking about Simon, the reader doesn't know which Simon he's talking about unless he tells you. And that's exactly what the Gospel authors do. And they do this with Mary. Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, Mary the mother of Salome. Every time you find these names in a group of people, they have to disambiguate the name, and the authors do it. So not only do they get the names right, they even know the practice of specifying the person to make sure you know who they're talking about. And I think that's absolutely amazing. You could take one other thing, just so we don't run out of time. One of the best small details, just like Samson. Let's look at the botany, at trees. Everybody knows the story of Zacchaeus, right? We all grew up with the Sunday school story and the song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, for the Lord he wanted to see. Now that comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19. It says a sycamore tree. So what do you ask? What question do you ask? Did they have sycamore trees where Zacchaeus lived in the first century? And if you read Luke, you find out he's in Jericho. And guess what? Sycamore trees grew in Jericho in the first century in Judea, and they didn't grow hardly anywhere else. Now that is just the smallest detail that we overlook, but that's a big detail when it comes to checking your accuracy.
Now, what difference does it make to say that the Gospels are historically reliable?
Well, the difference is it means you have to take it seriously. I mean, let's put it this way. You can't just dismiss them as legends or fairy tales or campfire stories. They're written as records of events, accurate records of events that tell a story of something that actually happened. So and what we just saw, to an intricate detail, intricate level of detail to do this. If they were just trying to communicate some kind of spiritual truth, that would be the main focus. You would find flaws in the way they relate the story in the smaller details, but the big spiritual message would be more accurate. And that's what we see in other documents that are trying to do that are being moral tales. And that's not the way the Gospels are written. The Gospels are written with historical accuracy and intentional accuracy. So what this difference makes is that you cannot just push them aside and say it's like Aesop's fables. It's not. They are saying that this happened. These events are real. They took place in a real time, and everything. If that is the case, then what they say happened matters to everybody in the world, because that's exactly why they wrote it. And I think that's the biggest difference it makes.
And if 1 or I should say over 2 billion Christians are actually out there trying to reach the lost, reaching all people, sharing the gospel with all people, and of course all people includes all Muslims, all Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and everybody else. They have a religious view. They have a belief that their book is actually true and historically reliable, and so on. And we as Christians can't just say, okay, well, yeah, you believe it sincerely, we believe it sincerely, so I guess we just need to agree to disagree. No, we need to contend for the truth and make a case for Christianity and defend Christianity and let them know what sets the Bible apart. And of course, that is one of the things is the historical reliability of the documents themselves. And when we bring in these details of archaeology, history, topography, geography, etc., that is something that we need to be aware of, so we can do apologetics, but also, when necessary, do polemics or critique that other worldview. Let that person know, I'm so great that you are sincere about what you believe, and you're so much more ahead of someone who says there is no God. But yet we still need to ask, who is God? Who is Jesus? Which book is actually his word? Because guess what? When we lay them side by side, we see many fundamental differences, fundamental things that are completely opposite. We see a bunch of things that cannot both be true or all be true. And of course, the Bible makes claims that completely reject the teachings that are found in other man-made religious books. Yeah. So when someone says, well, what if someone says, well, the Gospels, they have some historical facts, but I still deny that miracles are possible, or that actually more than that, the claims that it makes, I don't believe these miracles are historical. Like some people say, stories of Homer in ancient Greece, it's on the same level with the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I've heard this claim a couple times. I think there's a couple different ways you want to look at that. As far as even making the comparison with Homer, it is true that Homer in like the Iliad has some historical fact, but we have to remember that Homer wrote the Iliad about 400 years after the Trojan War, so there's no way he had any firsthand information of anything that happened. A lot of his historical details are pretty off. I mean, there is a place called Troy, and it was at war. But the Greeks, as far as we know, were not enemies of the Trojans. They were actually friends. There was no Helen of Troy. There was no Paris, or any of these characters. There's no Achilles, obviously. And he gets some of the geography right. But other than that, there's a lot of historical details that don't match up. But the Greeks, classical Greeks, didn't look at Homer's work as history. That was never their intention. Just as we were saying, they actually looked at Homer's work as character building, lessons on what it meant to be a real man and a real hero. So they're not really on the same level as the Gospels. So that kind of a comparison doesn't really hold up if you just look at some of the minor details of the two types of text. But the other thing you have to look at is to say, well, I believe in the history, but I can't accept the miracles. The question you just have to ask is why? What presupposition are you taking in with you? Yes, miracles are miraculous. They are something that's out of the ordinary. But as someone like Craig Keener has just done in his 2-volume work on miracles, they're still reported today. They've been reported for thousands of years. And unless you can sit back and you can say every single miracle account is wrong, which would take a massive amount of knowledge and time and research to be able to prove that, you can't simply just reject them unless you are starting off by saying there's nothing else but the natural world. And the very thing that the Gospels point out being set in history is that, yes, there is this natural world. And that's what makes these miraculous events so astonishing to the people in the Gospels. No one expects someone to come back from the dead. No one expects blind people to see. That's what made Jesus stand out. So you could try to accept the history and reject the miraculous, but really that requires some self-reflection on why you're rejecting something. Are you rejecting it just because you can't accept that part of the worldview? Or do you actually have reasons to think that these documents that are historically accurate in every other way just happen to make up this one detail? And I think those are serious questions that people should wrestle with if they're really interested in the truth. Those are questions they really have to ask.
And when we simply ask people, if we're talking with a Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, Muslim, whatever, if we, reiterate back to them some of the beliefs that they have and ask them, if what you sincerely believe were actually false, would you want to know? And based on the person's answer to that question of yes or no, that lets you know right away if they're actually being intellectually honest to say, well, no, if it was false, I would still believe it. Well, that is the epitome of blind faith. If someone says, yes, if I'm wrong, I do want to know, then of course that gives us an opportunity to give the evidence and to do the apologetics and defend the Christian faith. It really gets back to theology too, of where are we going to end up when we die? If a person believes that there is no hell, well, then there's not any really major consequence to being wrong. And of course, that's going to be the case if you're talking with, say, a Jehovah's Witness. But we definitely need to know what we believe, why we believe it, and when we make the claim that this book actually is historically reliable, we need to look to this evidence. We need to look to the work that Clark is doing and the work that many other professors have done as well. And there are many great resources on this topic. Clark, thank you so much for being here. Very informative. I know our audience is going to take this information and run with it. So thank you again for being here on Colliding Worldviews. I want to encourage people to check out your website, exegesis.com, and we will talk with you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me, Tony.
Friends, exegesis.com is where you need to go to get more about Clark and his great work. And we'll see you here next time on Colliding Worldviews.